Hello, and welcome back to Free Speech, the Naturally United podcast, where we talk about issues that affect the environment and humanity as a whole. And today we have something incredibly interesting we're going to be going over, which is 17 metallic compounds that are considered rare earth materials. Now, before we get into that, welcome to Season 4. This is going to be amazing. We have our biggest project yet that we have ever created as a community of over 1 million people, and ultimately it is going to allow anyone around the country who wants to plant trees in their local neighborhood to do so. So I will be getting in touch with individual community members about that, but keep your eyes out for volunteering opportunities around the country. At the end of the video, I'll break down in greater detail what that is going to look like. But without further ado, let's get into our episode about rare earth materials. I'm going to start this video off by explaining why rare earth materials are an incredibly important topic for us to think about. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, that's not even something I want to concern myself with, but this will affect everyone in the modern world, and here's why. Rare earth materials are used to make cars, televisions, laptops, computers, anything that has a microchip requires rare earth materials. And so the future of technology is dependent on the way that we respond to this issue directly. So when we look in between the 1970s and 1990s, what we see is that China was increasing their production of rare earth materials by about 40% from a year-to-year basis. And ultimately the reason for this being, of course, we saw a massive increase in production of technologically advanced goods, whether it is laptops, even car production became much more common throughout that time. So we're pulling more and more from the mines. China, who produces 90% of Earth's rare earth materials, comes out and says, hey, for a few of these materials, we only have about 10 or 15 years left in our mines. Meanwhile, they're producing 90% of the global supply, and you can see how that might present some issues. Now, I will say, the verbiage of saying rare earth materials is a little bit tricky when cerium is more common than copper. Cerium is a rare earth material that you can find more commonly than copper in the natural environment. So just being a rare earth material in general doesn't necessarily mean that the supply is incredibly low. However, at the rate of consumption that we have had of these materials, we are going to have to either think of a massive innovation in using material we've not used before to accomplish a technological task we have going on now, or figure out a way to use our current rations more properly and sustainably. And so this is going to be something that is going to affect the price of new cars, the price of new computers, the price of new phones. Any electronic good that you can think of will be affected by this, and it's ultimately why I decided to make a video about it. So let's dive into some of the more specifics. How many years are left for particular materials, and what can we do about it? Now, if you're thinking, how does this apply to me? Well, the cell phone that you have in your pocket uses over 60 elements just in order to get produced. And when we think about the implications of those 60 elements being mined, multiplied by every single person who owns a cell phone, you could see how this issue could get incredibly tricky as the global population is reaching nearly 10 billion people in our lifetime. And so ultimately, here are the numbers. And now something that you should definitely take into consideration is that these are numbers that are reported by the Chinese government. It's not necessarily something that we should think of as empirically objective. But that being said, they're reporting these numbers, and so it's really important that we at least take note of what they're saying. So here is an example of 4 different materials and the amount of time that China suggests that they have left in their mines. Now, keep in mind, China is producing 90% of Earth's rare earth materials. So first, we have indium, which has a supply of 10 years left. You can see how that would be incredibly concerning. Now, something to keep in mind here, if you've never heard of, and I hadn't either until I looked into this, cryolite, because they stopped using it before I was born, cryolite kind of ran through this cycle that we're going through now, where it was incredibly overused and it was used for processing aluminum ore, and ultimately there was not enough of the supply left for all of the miners to justify the cost of going in and collecting and extracting the material. So we decided that we could move to a synthetic substitute. And I think that's what we're probably going to have to do with a lot of these rare earth materials that we have now. And so ultimately, indium has 10 years of supply left. Another concerning one is platinum is at 15 years, silver is at 20 years, and aluminum is at 80 years. Now, aluminum is something that we've gotten pretty good at recycling, but still, thinking that one of the materials on that list that has a little bit more time still has less than a century is pretty terrifying when we think of the implications of, well, we want our society to survive for thousands of years. How can we do that? So I would say that our population of 8 billion people around the world, and consuming all the goods that we constantly do, has to bring up these questions. What do we do when the well runs dry? And so ultimately there are a couple different ways that we can go from here, but it's really important to remember that this issue affects everything. Maybe we think to ourselves perhaps it's possible for us to find more sustainable sources, but something to keep in mind is that even building a wind turbine, you need these materials. So as people who have a limited number of each particular chemical, we are going to have to be incredibly careful about our usage and also be incredibly honest and objective with ourselves about what is the supply of this particular chemical and what are we going to do if it runs out. Now, I don't necessarily want to make this a doomsday video, but it is definitely something that is very important that everyone should consider because it has direct impact on your life. And so ultimately, I gathered a few different items that if we were to run out of rare earth materials, humanity would no longer be able to produce. So I thought that I would just read through that real quick and then end the video on a little bit of a better note. But listen to this. These are all the things that we couldn't produce without rare earth materials. And learning a few of them, I was really astonished. So obviously we have smartphones, cameras, computer hard disks, televisions, LED lights, monitors, speakers, magnets, wind turbines, catalytic converters, crude oil, aircraft engines, welding and glass-making tools, X-ray and MRI machines, and the list just goes on and on. There are so many different things that we use all the time that are on this list where if we ran out of rare earth materials, we'd never be able to produce those again. So it's just really, really important for us to consider what is the global supply, how are we conserving it, and how are we recycling it? Now, the tricky aspect of a lot of these situations is that you can't necessarily pull apart a computer chip and extract the original material very easily. So we are going to have to get very, very innovative about how we use the materials at hand. But something to keep in mind beyond that is that even if we were to move on to a different material, then we still need to be using that material sustainably in order to actually continue to make those products. And so ultimately, this is going to be one of the very, very large challenges that we face going forward. For example, we look at a country like America, who has said by 2030, half of the cars will be electric cars. That is a spectacular idea that I think probably would reduce global emissions a lot, but something to keep in mind is we only have about 10% of the rare earth material supply that we would need in order to facilitate that goal. And so ultimately, I think that the children of the future are really going to have to get innovative, of course, about the energy that we use to power our world and how we use our materials. But we are now at a global crossroads where the largest producer of chemicals that pretty much every civilized nation around the world is using. Now, sure, there are probably some countries that this affects more than others. You think of somewhere like America where the vast majority of people have cell phones. Think of the implications of that cascading down on everyone else. So I think hearing that list, what you should think about is what are potential solutions for this issue. Now you have situations like cryolite in the past where we've used a synthetic solution, but not everything has a synthetic counterpart. And so humanity is going to have to get very creative about how do we prioritize who gets to have these electronic devices. Is it just going to be the rich? Is it just going to be the government? I think that, unfortunately, those are issues that we are going to run into and have to face head on. But beyond that, the perspective that I have after researching rare earth materials, honestly, for years, I've been fascinated by the idea that we're potentially going to run out of these, is this. We are going to have to live with a situation that is in front of us, regardless. And that obviously applies to everything, but with this, it is even more pertinent. We have to deal with the situation that's in front of us. Right now, what we face is that China is the largest producer of rare earth materials around the world. Some people even say as high as 97%. and yet they say their mines only have a few decades left. It is an issue that we have to take very seriously, and I thank you for giving 10 minutes to think about it a little bit. So this has been Season 4, Episode 1 of Free Speech. It's so amazing to be back, and we are creating a cryptocurrency that's going to plant trees. I will update you guys about that soon.